As a professional involved in electricity delivery, the T&D World podcast and tdworld.com is your definitive source for breaking news, industry updates, and more. We've got you covered from transmission to distribution and everything that affects the power grid. And now, on to today's episode.
Hello and welcome to T&D World Live podcast. I am Jeff Postlethwaite, managing editor with T&D World, and we are focusing in on cooperatives today. Those utilities that a lot of them are sort of, in maybe further flung areas, but they serve an enormously diverse and huge geographical area in the United States. So we have Jim Matheson, CEO of NRECA. Thanks for joining us today, Jim.
Oh, thanks, Jeff. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, of course. I always love to get the co-op point of view in, So I suppose I should start with a lot of my colleagues are in the middle of the country right now, are getting snowed in. How are some of the central U.S. cooperatives doing with these blizzard conditions? Are they coming to you and talking about it?
Yeah, we have a number of co-ops that are experiencing outages. This is a pretty far-flung storm in multiple states. As you know, though, whenever that happens, this is when co-ops in some ways exhibit some of their finest qualities in terms of mutual assistance, mutual aid, going to other cooperative service territories to help restoration of power. But this is a bit of a slow-moving storm. I've heard in some states we're still waiting for it to pass before we can go in and even assess how much damage there is. But for late March, mid to late March, this is a little unusual, but it does happen. And it's because co-ops serve so much land mass. I mean, we serve 56% of all the land mass in this country. So when these storms hit over large areas, it always has a significant impact on our infrastructure.
For sure, yeah. And I grew up in an area like that in Oklahoma. That was a lot of cooperatives and I was gonna get to mutual assistance, just to broaden the topic a little bit. Cooperatives are often big participants in helping sometimes larger utilities with disaster response. So could you say a little bit more about how things are evolving with how utilities come together after things
Sure.
like hurricanes and tornadoes, blizzards? I saw even some of your cooperatives went out to Jamaica recently.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the electric sector in general has great coordination, whether it's the investor-owned utilities, the municipal utilities, or the electric cooperatives. Historically, there may have been some friction between those groups, but that's long gone. Those days are long gone. And in fact, we have this coordinating function with our federal partners in the government. It's called the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, and Department of Energy is the lead on that. But whenever there's a major storm event, we get together and convene both all the electric sector and the relevant government agencies. It may be Homeland Security, it may be the Department of Transportation, where we're having trouble getting access on certain roadways, or we may need exemptions from the FAA to fly drones into it to look at the damage. So there's this great structure in place already for all the electric sector and the federal partners to address these storms in the moment and do our best to get the lights back on. And then electric cooperatives, well, the first line of mutual aid is they go help other cooperatives. There's a lot of folks helping investor-owns help co-ops too. The mutual assistant translates across all of the different types of utilities as well. And it really speaks well to that level of coordination. It's never easy. It's often dangerous because you've got people in situations they're unfamiliar with. They're anxious and incentivized to get the power on fast, and yet you got to maintain safety as your number one objective. And that's a hallmark of the electric sector to do that. But that's how the co-ops really work in terms of those mutual assistance circumstances. A lot of coordination going on. And my gosh, you'll have co-ops like recent winter storm Fern, which is a few weeks ago. We had co-ops from Oregon coming to do work in like Mississippi. So they cover a long distance, and it's not just the personnel, it's also the equipment, because that's always needed in those times where there's significant storm damage.
Yeah, I always love those kinds of stories. We're going to be having one about Winter Storm Fern coming out in our next issue that we're just laying out now. And yeah, I love hearing those stories about people coming in and just sort of being everyday heroes to these people who, I mean, we've all been in a situation, I think, where we're really waiting for the power to come back on, and it's not fun.
Yeah.
So to talk about one specific kind of disaster, we're heading into wildfire season, which is a season that is sort of growing. How are cooperatives looking to be supported by your NRECA or by legislators with their wildfire mitigation plans?
Well, look, as you described, wildfire risk has been around for a while, but it seems to be growing in terms of the risk. And, since electric cooperatives serve such wide expanses of land, we have a lot of infrastructure that is vulnerable to wildfire risk, particularly in the western half of the country, although we're seeing wildfires in the eastern half of the country too in some cases. Listen, there are a number of issues that we should take on. Some require public policy assistance and some are on us as the industry. And one of the key things as the industry is, and our cooperative has been really good at stepping up the plate on this, is you really do need to have a mitigation plan to try to get in front of it. Some of it, I'm not a technical person, but some of it's pretty straightforward. You have these rights of way, and you got to make sure you go and clear the vegetation away in the rights of way so you don't have trees that are falling on the wires, which can help create and spark a fire. So mitigating at the front end before the wildfire is where that preparatory work really matters, and having a plan in place. So you're not just making up as you go, but really developing a thoughtful wildfire mitigation plan is essential. And by the way, you can't just cookie cutter this where every utility has the same plan, because different service territories, just different geographic locations, are going to require different plans. So you really have to be thoughtful and do it for your own utility. And that applies to municipals and investor owns as well. But in the co-op world, we're really careful about customizing those plans to the individual service territory. By the way, at this stage of the game, to get liability insurance, I would think you're required to have one of these wildfire mitigation plans, but we've worked hard as the National Association for the 900 electric co-ops across this country to help provide them the tools to develop these plans. They've done a good job. And since you also asked about the public policy world, we're working hard in Washington right now to make sure on a lot of the public lands areas, which are primarily the western states, whether it be Forest Service land or Bureau of Land Management land, that we have access to go in and do that maintenance work on our rights of way. Your listeners may be shocked to hear this, but even if you have a right of way, you still periodically have to get a permit to go in and clear vegetation on it. I was surprised when I first heard that. And there's this huge backlog of permit applications to go in to do wildfire vegetation management at both the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. That's really frustrating because we want to get in and do the right thing. And that's one where public policy doesn't require a vote of Congress, doesn't require any change in policy. It just requires the agencies to process these things quickly so we can get out and do what we need to do. Beyond that, there's some conversations going on in Washington about liability protections, issues of that nature. And then there's a whole bunch of activity in states at the state level on the public policy as well, where different states have jumped into this more than others, primarily in the Western United States.
Right, yeah. If you look at a map of us out west, it's a lot of publicly managed land. And that kind of raised a question for me. You mentioned working with Homeland Security. With some of these changes that the administration and, well, we had the Department of Government Efficiency there for a minute, coming in and making some pretty sweeping changes with regard to, bureaucrats and how many agencies have how much headcount. Are you seeing any slowdown when it comes to permit approvals or anything like that? Any bottlenecks happening as a result?
And there's a wide range of activities relative to this question. We have activities of permitting and approvals, whether it's the public lands agencies, whether it's the Department of Agriculture, where the Rural Utility Service exists, and with their permitting applications before electric cooperatives can borrow money, Department of Energy grants. To be candid, across the board, we have not seen a significant slowdown in permitting. We've seen where this administration has been very open to accelerating permit applications. They've asked us to bring to their attention if there is a problem where things are moving slower than they should, and that's worked really well. But since you mentioned Homeland Security, I would mention FEMA, which is within the Department of Homeland Security. And FEMA is a critical partner for electric cooperatives and for municipals in terms of disaster response, because we're non-for-profit, owned by the consumers we serve. We don't rate base expenses for storm restoration. It just all goes to the consumer's bill. Public policy in Congress has dictated that FEMA helps absorb some of the costs of that storm restoration. And FEMA has been an agency that over the years has been good to work with in many respects, but not as good as it could be as far as we're concerned. And in the current environment, FEMA's got a bit of a backlog in terms of approvals, although we see things starting to move in that regard. But since we're talking FEMA, I got to say, and I'm getting away from your question a little bit, there's legislation in Congress to reform FEMA that we are very excited about in terms of a public policy move. The lead sponsor, Sam Graves from Missouri. I went through the Transportation Infrastructure Committee in a bipartisan vote. 57-3 it passed, and now we're anxious to get that bill out for the full House of Representatives to vote on. But it would really improve FEMA in a way that makes sense for electric cooperatives, and we'd love to see that done because, again, a critical partnership that's existed for years, and this bill would just make it work better.
Right, yeah. Well, you're here in the DC area working with a lot of these policy questions. I wanted to ask, lately there's been a lot of changes with regard to EPA regulation and other environmental regulations that has an effect on utilities. The EPA repealed its mercury rule, policies limiting pollution are sunsetting. Can you tell me how these policies will impact cooperatives while they're trying to keep things clean, safe, and also affordable?
It's a great question. You know, in the cooperative world, and I mentioned there are over 900 co-ops across the country. One of the cooperative principles is autonomy and local control. That's baked into what electric cooperative business model is all about. And our members are fiercely independent about, we make the right decision for what's in our location. It may not be the right decision for someone in another place, but it's the right decision for us. The reason I lead my answer with that comment is because that really affects how we look at advocacy in the policy world for electric cooperatives. Is we try to create more choices and more flexibility for our members. We're all for finding incentives to make options more viable. We're all for trying to get rid of mandates or restrictions that limit the ability of cooperatives to make decisions that make sense for their particular location. That being said, your question about where the EPA is, we believe the EPA has gone too far, particularly on the Clean Power Plan. We think they've exceeded their authority of the Clean Air Act under Congress, and we're actually pleased the Trump administration moved ahead to overturn that rule because it has extremely significant impacts on the flexibility for the electric sector, not just co-ops, to meet the massive increase in demand that is right in front of us. And we think that the previous EPA went beyond its statutory authority and also beyond the zones of reasonableness in terms of having some balanced approach to how we can move ahead in this country in a sustainable way to make sure we meet the demands of the electric system's experiencing. So we are happy to see fewer restrictions, fewer constraints on what we can do. We think there's still a significant foundational base of environmental controls in this country where the electric sector is a lot cleaner than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. But some of these regulations have gone too far. And if it's a public policy, we want to go farther than that, then Congress needs to do that. Congress needs to put this in statute. The EPA has exceeded its authority, and Congress has chosen not to get involved. And so far, the courts have agreed with us on those issues.
Gotcha. Well, I'm glad you mentioned demand, because I did want to talk about the long-term reliability picture. How do we get to a place where NRECA and its member cooperatives, or as a country even, how do we get to where we can build some of the things that almost everybody in the industry knows that we're going to need to help meet this demand? I mean, if you look at NERC or FERC, all of their recommendations and all of what pressure groups like NRECA are asking for are very similar. So there's a lot of agreement, but how do we get there?
Well, it's not going to be easy. Even though we can all see in the big picture what needs to happen in terms of this significant forecast in demand growth in this country. By the way, not just from data centers and AI, although that's a significant player, but the electrification of the economy in general is driving this demand. And, we're looking to pivot from historically, if you look back, there was a long period of time where electric demand in this country was flat for many, many years. So this is a shift for the industry to address this in terms of investment in new generation. But there are a couple of things I'd raise in response to your question. Number one, before we talk about creating new resources, we ought to talk about maintaining what we've got. We are shutting down power plants for the end of their useful life without providing replacement for that existing capacity. That doesn't sound like a good idea to me. It's the old cliche, when you find yourself in a hole, the first step is stop digging deeper. And we've allowed public policy to drive closure of electric power plants before the end of their useful life. And I think that's a mistake. So we've got to find ways to maintain assets that still have a useful life to help meet this demand, as we also are looking to add resources to our electric infrastructure, both transmission and generation, by the way. This is not just purely a generation play. Transmission is another critical part of how we as a country are going to meet this increased demand. Look, on the policy side, there's a couple of basic ideas. One is it's too hard to build some in this country. The permitting process has lost its way. It doesn't mean we should get rid of a permitting process. We should have an appropriate process to determine whether new infrastructure projects are sound or if they're not. But the way the process has evolved over the years in this country, it's gotten dragged out, unpredictable. Uncertainty is risk. Risk is cost. That affects consumers. We need a more predictable and time-bound process where we get to either a yes, go ahead, or thumbs down, no, you're not doing the project. But yes or no in some ways are both better than maybe, where we don't know what's going to happen with permitting. And that's not unique to the electric sector. There are other sectors of the economy that feel this way. But I do sense a growing consensus building in the policy world among Republicans and Democrats that we got to do something with permitting. And that hasn't always been the case. But that is the case now, and what we would like to see is some defined period of time where that's how long the process takes. We'd like to find true authority for one agency that manages the process, because nominally that exists, but you got all these government agencies pointing at each other saying, well, it's not us, it's them. Well, somebody's got to own the process. And finally, there's got to be some boundaries around which the whole litigation component of these permits is also played out. It can't just drag out for years and years and years. We all have our stories about projects that have taken so long. New electric transmission lines that have taken 20 years to get to the point where we can start construction. That is not a way for us to meet this demand that is right in front of us today. So permitting reform, big one. If I can get out for one more, and I'm giving you a long answer because this is an important question about how we take on this demand, we've got to take a serious look at the broader electric supply chain, all the supply chain of components that allow electric system to work. There are disruptions in the supply chain. There are shortages. There are increased costs because it's a global supply chain. We've learned that in the last 5 years in a significant way. And if there's public policy actions we can take through Congress, through the President's authority under the Defense Production Act, if there are steps we can take to prioritize enhancement of these supply chains to make sure we've got the materials it takes to meet this demand, that's the other policy area we need to have a really detailed conversation on to make sure we're doing the right thing.
Yeah, I agree with what you said earlier that the electrification could end up being a bigger deal than data centers and AI, but I spend a lot of time on this podcast and in my coverage talking about data centers and AI. So, you represent rural utilities, and I start to wonder, can you help me understand how some of your members feel about tech companies who are wanting to come into their communities and build what are these very large consumers, maybe their biggest consumer that they've ever had?
Yeah, no question. They certainly would be for a number of our members. Look, I mentioned earlier that co-ops are very individualistic in how they view things. So I would be remiss if I said all co-ops view it in one way. That being said, look, the rural areas are likely candidates in this country for data centers. Land is less expensive. There's more space to do it. And data centers are served by electric cooperatives today, particularly along the mid-Atlantic area, particularly Virginia. We've got significant experience with electric cooperatives serving data centers. They've been doing so for years. Of course, the data centers keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And at the end of the day, I think the electric cooperatives, and I'm not, you could argue the same applies for the other utilities, the munis and the IOUs. But look, I think at the end of the day, it all depends on how you structure the deal. You want to protect your existing consumers. You want to make sure the hyperscalers are paying their fair share. The hyperscalers do bring some things to the table as well. I mean, it is a load that runs 24/7. So to the extent the utility sector has assets that are not being utilized for many hours of the year, i.e. the off-peak hours, and there's an entity that wants to consume during that, that creates some upside for the utilities as well. So if you negotiate the right deal, where you allocate risk and cost appropriately, we see a path forward where it can make sense in some locations, and it's not going to make sense in other locations in terms of electric cooperatives. I can tell you that no, I'm sure it's no surprise to hear that, data centers are knocking on the door of every electric cooperative. They're knocking, and that raises a second issue, which is how real are these people knocking on the door? Because some of them are the big hyperscalers, and we've all heard of these big tech companies. A lot of them are just developers that want to tie something up and then hopefully sell it to another hyperscaler. And you don't know how real that is or not. So we're being, as a membership, the electric cooperatives across the country, being thoughtful about making sure that they're talking with someone who's real and legitimate, making sure that as the relationship develops, is the power supply and the transmission capacity appropriately available to meet this load in this service territory? And then how do you structure the relationship so you're not incurring undue burden and cost on the existing consumers? And it's easy for me to say that in a couple of minutes like I just have as a concept. We all know that that is an incredibly complicated set of decisions and issues that have to be understood to get to where you need to be. But at the end of the day, that's the way electric cooperatives are approaching this.
You talked about hyperscalers paying their fair share. How do we decide what that is,
Well,
and who decides what that is?
Great question. I don't think there's a simple playbook for that, but I do think you want to try to. And again, I'm not in the position of negotiating directly with the hyperscaler as a utility. I run the National Association for all the co-ops, but again, who is bringing what different values and risks to the table, and how do you address those in a way to, I know it's an overused term, but how do you make it a win-win? That should be the objective of the negotiations. And I know you can't take this down to the penny in terms of who's paying for what, but to the extent that your rates are what they are before the hyperscaler comes in and consumers are paying that rate, and investments are making in the systems, and those investments are they 100% for the benefit only of the data center, or is there some benefit to the existing consumers as well? That's where it gets more complicated, and how you allocate appropriately the investments and recouping those investments from the different consumers. So I'm not ducking your question. I'm just saying that's a great question without an easy answer.
Well, that's why I ask everybody, is because everyone has a different answer. I've gone to Tech Advantage, and I've heard some of your speakers talk. A couple of the things they always mention with co-ops: vast geographical areas, but also some of the most economically fragile areas in the United States. So at a time when everything is costing more and more, what can co-ops do to sort of address their customers' worries, their needs about rising electricity prices, if they can do anything about it?
Well, first of all, I appreciate you raising the issue, because I think that we've had, appropriately so, this huge focus on reliability and this growing demand, and how are we going to keep the system reliable? And that's still a really important issue. But this affordability issue that you just asked about, I think that's another really significant issue for the electric sector in general, and particularly for electric cooperatives. You mentioned we serve vulnerable areas. We serve 92% of all persistent poverty counties in America. So as much as poverty is sometimes viewed as an urban issue, I'm here to tell you there's also rural poverty. And we serve 92%, as I said, of all the counties, or persistent poverty counties in America. We are owned by the consumers we serve. We don't have shareholders. Every impact, every action, every decision that affects the economics of an electric cooperative goes straight to the consumer's bill. So as you would imagine, since we're consumer owned and consumer governed, because our consumers elect their board members to their individual cooperative, the focus on the consumer interest and affordability has always been there at the individual electric cooperatives. But now, from a policy perspective, it's a big issue for all of us. Again, I wish I could give you the magic formula that corrects this issue instantaneously. That doesn't exist. But what we can do is we can look for opportunities, number one, to create a more efficient way that we build infrastructure, because when you have permitting delays and legal delays that stretch things out over multiple years, number one, that's a cost driver for the overall cost of the project. Number two, the supply chain issue that I previously talked about. If there's anything we do to relieve the constraints in that system, because when there's a constraint in the old laws of supply and demand, if supply doesn't meet demand, prices go up. If there's anything we can do to accelerate greater supply in many of these components within the supply chain, that's going to have a mitigating impact on the overall cost. And by the way, I'm talking about all aspects of the electricity supply chain. We focus on building a new power plant. Yeah, that costs a lot more money than it used to. We're building a big transmission line, and that costs a lot more. But there's basic stuff at the distribution level, meters and crossbars and insulators, and everything's gone up more than the general inflation rate if you look back over the last 5 years. And so to the extent that there's a supply chain component to help, there are actions that can be taken to reduce some of those pressures in the supply chain. I think that helps with affordability. But let's not kid ourselves. We're looking at this massive increase in demand in this country. And so there's a lot of demand for all these supply chain components. So permitting reform, supply chain improvement, that can help us. Another area I'll jump into, but without a specific proposal, is we've got to find better ways to harmonize the electric sector and the natural gas sector in terms of pricing. During these storm events in particular, the pricing of natural gas just, 60 times what the normal price is. I mean, just amazing short-term impacts. We had one co-op who said, in one case, I spent 60 days worth of about 60 days worth of gas in one day because of the price increase. And so to the extent we can find some harmonization and some ability to accommodate during those winter storm events when there's extreme pressure on our natural gas delivery system in this country for heating and processes there, and also for how we're handling increased electric demand, that's another area where affordability could be addressed.
Yeah, sticking with supply chain for a moment, how would you, I've been tracking this, and I just try to keep my finger on the pulse of it. How would you characterize the wait times, the pressure that this puts on construction projects, reconductoring? Would you say that that's like persisting as bad as it's been, or is it worsening? Is it getting a little better? How is it?
I don't have actual data for you, but from my engagement with our membership, I think it's at a minimum, it's persisting. And the answer is, well, there may have been, because demand is, in the laws of economics, if there's huge demand, people are going to create more supply. So yeah, that's kind of happened over the last few years, but at the same time, demand keeps growing. We've got this massive demand taking place in the electric grid for more power. And as I said, it's not just generation, it's the whole range of different electric grid supply chain. But I think it continues to persist. You don't build, just like you don't build a power plant or a transmission line in 90 days, you don't build a new manufacturing facility in 90 days either. These are all capital intensive assets that take time to bring up to speed. You want to have some sense of certainty that the market's still going to be there. That's where public policy might be able to help, might be able to create some floor pricing or some floor guarantees to incent people to more rapidly create more domestic manufacturing capacity in this country for supply chain. We've lived it within the co-op world pretty extensively, because you're probably familiar with the largest distribution transformer manufacturer in the United States is actually owned by electric co-ops. It's ERMCO. And ERMCOs have been very aggressive at increasing their manufacturing capacity to meet this growing demand. But again, you can't just do that where you just flip a switch and it happens. And oh, by the way, let me throw one other variable in on that ERMCO's experienced. And that is there's a labor component to that manufacturing. And you can't, this requires a certain level of training and capacity for labor. And that always isn't easy to fill as well. So I've laid out I've laid out a number of factors that affect this. I haven't given you the simple solution to all of it, but I think that's what the electric sector is facing in general.
Right. Well, I've been writing primarily about AI when it comes to, the demand and all of that. That's a big thing, obviously. But is there anything that you would have to educate us about when it comes to what AI might be able to do for the utilities in terms of especially cooperatives? Because when I come to Tech Advantage, I see that a lot of co-ops actually kind of end up being little laboratories for, technology in a way that people might not think. So is there something you can tell us about that?
Yeah, first of all, and it's funny you say that because I've said, I've been working here running this organization for about 10 years. And, if you're from the outside not familiar with the industry, you might think, well, these co-ops are smaller than the other utilities. They're probably a little behind on all this stuff. And it turns out that's not true. In some ways, being smaller gives you more agility to be nimble and to embrace technology. Secondly, in many states, we're not regulated, so we don't have to go through some rate-basing public utility commission effort if we want to make an investment in something. And finally, when you serve the most expensive, hardest to serve areas in America, man, you lean into technology because it can create efficiencies that may be even more valuable to co-ops than to other utilities that serve more densely populated areas. So historically, and I'm going to get to your AI in a minute, but historically, let's just take something as basic as automatic meter infrastructure, AMI, which has been around for a long time now. Electric cooperatives have always led the country in terms of total penetration of AMI compared to the rest of the electric utility sector, because it makes so much sense for us to do it based on these large, we got co-ops that have, less than 2 people per mile. That's how sparsely populated it is. So technology is always been a friend of electric cooperatives, and with artificial intelligence, that continues to be the case. We have tremendous ability in terms of how AI can help us on an issue we talked about a little earlier, which is wildfire mitigation. We got these. We've got more miles of distribution lines in this country than the investor owns, even though we don't serve the majority of the population. That's a lot of wide open space and a lot of infrastructure to maintain. And AI gives us new tools in terms of how to appropriately mitigate wildfire risk. It's a really exciting time for AI to help us with that, both on vegetation management, looking for areas where danger trees may be. You can use satellite technology, you can use AI to help us do that. So at the distribution level, AI has been really helpful. It's also helpful at the generation and transmission level, where we have our larger co-ops that own power generation and high voltage transmission as well. And we've had different cooperatives who've tried different things, which in your question, you said co-ops kind of serve as the laboratories. That's what's been really interesting, is that different co-ops look for different ways to deploy this. And of course, in the cooperative world, we all share that information with each other because that's what cooperatives do. But I think it's exciting, and there's been some progress, but I bet you if we got together 2 years from now, we'd say, wow, look at all this stuff that AI did that we didn't even think about 2 years ago. I think we're still on the steep part of the curve in terms of how much gain we're going to see from AI creating greater productivity and efficiency in the electric sector. And I think it's a really exciting time.
Yeah, it definitely could be. I wanted to take a step back and talk about reliability a bit, because
Sure.
some of your members are G&T providers, and I just wanted to ask about baseload, reliable, carbon-free energy. I don't necessarily, you don't play favorites on power gen, but can you tell me what NRECA does in terms of like defending hydropower as an asset, or maybe promoting nuclear as an asset?
Sure. Look, I mentioned earlier, we like to create as many options for our members as possible. And in some places, hydropower is really significant, not the least of which is the Pacific Northwest. We have been very aggressive in maintaining the integrity of the BPA dam system. We strongly opposed what the Biden administration was trying to do to put those, particularly the 4 dams on the Lower Snake River, in a situation where they were going to put on so many operational constraints that it was really going to undercut the entire economics of those dams, and we think was really just an effort to try to ultimately get them breached. So we've been very aggressive in advocating for that, the maintaining of those dams. We've had a lot of success, quite frankly, with the Trump administration, who understands that issue, why we would get rid of this resource of carbon-free, always available power in the face of increasing demand. I don't get it, and I'm not completely dismissing the issue of how we have a viable salmon population. It's an incredibly complex issue with a lot of factors, but to say the simple answer is just breach the dams, well, that's just a simple answer, and it's really not the right answer. So we've been very aggressive on hydro. Nuclear, we're certainly an advocate for finding ways for and it's probably going to have to be a public-private partnership. The risks and the costs of this, there really does need to be, in my opinion, some government participation in this to make this work. But we really do need to find a way in this country to uh, uh, create a much more economically viable option for nuclear. I think in the long run, it has to be part of the supply in terms of a carbon-free, always available resource. Now, you're talking about the conventional large nuclear plants we had today, you're talking about advanced nuclear, small SMRs, and the answer is I think we ought to be looking at both in terms of what makes sense for this country moving forward. We've certainly been an advocate for increased research funding from DOE about this. I know some of our members have engaged in licensing agreements on some of the SMR technologies. So we do recognize the value of that as part of the picture. And there aren't many chances for us to restart a shutdown nuclear plant, but you're probably familiar with the Palisades plant in Michigan. The entity is going to purchase that and restart it, has entered into a power purchase agreement. Electric cooperatives are taking all of the output of the Palisades plant between Wolverine Power in Michigan and Hoosier Power in Indiana. We're taking all of it. And the developer who's restarting that nuclear plant, which is more of a conventional one, is also looking at trying to permit it to locate SMRs on the same site. So we do have some experience where we're specifically involved in new addition of nuclear capacity to this to the country's grid. And I think it's got to be part of the equation. Look, I told you earlier, we want our members to have as many choices as they have, and we try not to be technology specific in terms of favoring one over the other. But I will say this. We do favor the value of always available, or in the industry, it's called dispatchable power. But on Capitol Hill, no one knows what dispatchable is, so that's why I use the term always available. But there is a difference, and it doesn't mean that intermittent power does not have value, because it does as part of a portfolio. But it's got to be part of a portfolio. And right now we see, well, not right now, I should say over the last several years, we've seen a significant amount of new capacity added as intermittent, and not much that is always available. And I don't think there's a specific point where that's a tipping point where it goes from it works to it doesn't work, but there is some zone out there where you can't go much further. And we've got to be smart as a country about making sure we have adequate dispatchable resources to meet the growing demand in this country in a reliable way.
Good. Yeah. Good points. Well, as we're coming to a close here, is there anything else you want us to understand about the work co-ops are doing, or maybe the work that you're doing in DC? Is there anything upcoming that you might expect to happen soon?
Well, first of all, I'd say I think this is the most exciting industry in America right now. And, the electric utility sector, historically, no one would have said that about the electric sector. But there is so much going on right now. And, we just had, you mentioned, we have our meeting once a year, this kind of an annual meeting. And we have Tech Advantage as part of that. The interest is unbelievable. We had over 11,000 people in Nashville last week. I see tremendous interest on the part of electric cooperatives and their staff. I see tremendous interest on the part of various technology vendors wanting to work with cooperatives on issues. That wasn't the case 5 years ago, where that level of interest, not even close. So first of all, this is an exciting time, and we can talk about all the challenges and how these are hard to figure out, and they're complicated, and there's not an easy answer. Man, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be optimistic. I'm excited about the level of interest in this sector, in the electric sector, on the part of so many people. And I think we're at, in some ways, a fascinating inflection point for the future of this country, because I think electricity is going to be the underlying, as it's been in other respects in the past, it's still the underlying building block for how this country functions. I think it's going to go well. You asked something that's coming up. We, once a year, although we engage with policymakers all the time, we have, as most organizations do, our legislative fly-in, where we got about 2,000 electric cooperative leaders from around the country, either CEOs of the co-ops or board members of co-ops, and they come to Washington, and we go and we engage not just with Congress. We always have done that, but we also meet with various executive branch agencies, because so much policy making is happening in the executive branch agencies. So whether it's EPA or the public lands agencies or Department of Energy or the Department of Agriculture, which is critical to electric cooperatives, or whether it's, and I know this is T&D is an electric entity, but we also have a lot of co-ops in broadband. So we want to meet with the FCC on broadband issues. So it's a really exciting time for us to have a show of force in Washington to really make sure the cooperative perspective on these issues is well understood by policymakers. And that's coming up in April, and we're real excited to have that as well.
Yeah, it's an industry that is sometimes thought of as being a little afraid of change or slow to change. But thanks for coming by and telling us about how change is being embraced by cooperatives. Jim, great to have you with us. Jim Matheson, CEO of NRECA, the National Rural Electric Cooperatives Association. And if you are out there listening and you're with a co-op, you have a story that you want to tell, reach out to us here at T&D World, and we'd be glad to help tell that story. I'm serious about saying that we do want to have the cooperative point of view. So thanks for helping us out with that.
Okay, thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks again for listening to today's podcast, produced by Endeavor Business Media, a division of Endeavor B2B. To hear the latest information for power delivery professionals and industry best practices, subscribe to T&D World Podcast and visit our website, tdworld.com, where you can find insightful articles and sign up for our free daily newsletter.